Leafa spun around to face Kirito, her eyes wide with urgency. We have to make a run for the town, Kirito now. She yelled. Kirito looked confused. But shouldn't we hide again? He asked. Leafa shook her head. The enemy knows we took out their tracer. When they get here they'll send a bunch of searchers to look for us. We can't hide anymore. She paused, catching her breath. And that was a fire familiar we just saw. Which means the people chasing us are. Kirito finished her sentence. Salamanders. The sound of heavy footsteps was getting closer and closer. Leafa glanced back, and for a split second she saw a flash of red light in the darkness. Let's go, she shouted. They took off running as fast as they could. As they moved, Leafa checked her map to make sure they were on the right track. She saw that their path would soon lead them to a huge underground lake. The tunnel they were in would turn into a bridge that crossed the lake. And on the other side of the bridge was the gate to Lugru, a city deep beneath the earth where miners dug for precious treasures. In these special cities, players couldn't attack each other, so even if the bad guys had a lot of players they couldn't harm Leafa and her friends there. But why were so many salamanders traveling together? Leafa was puzzled and bit her lip. It seemed that their enemies had been tracking them the whole time. Thanks to a tracer. Luckily Yua's search power had been working non-stop since they left Swilvan, trying to uncover any hidden dangers. It's crazy that they were able to pull it off. The only way they could have done this is if someone cast a spell on them while they were in town. You see, different fairy groups are naturally good at certain types of magic. Sylphs are great with wind magic. Gnomes are awesome at earth magic and so on. But here's the thing, anyone can learn any kind of magic if they practice hard enough. What's really surprising is that red bat she destroyed. It was a super powerful spell that combined tracking skills with the ability to reveal hidden things. Learning a super powerful fire spell like that would be almost impossible for anyone who isn't a salamander. As they ran she said to herself, there has to be a salamander inside Swilvan. But that was a crazy idea. Swilvan is a place where lots of different kinds of people are welcome. But salamanders are definitely not friends with them. In fact, salamanders are watched really closely, because they're considered enemies. The guardians were like superheroes, ready to pounce if they sensed any danger. If they had spotted anyone they would have charged in with their swords flashing. It's super hard to sneak past them. Just then, Kirito yelled. Hey, the lake! Leafa snapped back to attention and looked up. The rough floor was changing to cobblestones, and ahead of her she saw a big opening that led to dark blue water. A stone bridge stretched out over the lake, connecting to the massive castle gate of Lugru on the other side. The wall of the castle went all the way up to the ceiling of the huge room. They were so close to winning. If they could just make it into the city they'd be safe. For a second she felt a little better and looked back. But their pursuers were still coming, their red lights shining in the distance. She picked up speed, feeling like she was going to make it. As they ran across the bridge, the air felt a bit cooler, which gave her an extra burst of energy. They sprinted across the bridge, the air thick with the scent of water. We're going to make it, one of them exclaimed. But the other warned, stay sharp, don't slip and fall in, there's a gigantic monster lurking in the lake. Just as they reached a round lookout point right in the middle of the bridge, two bright lights zoomed overhead, piercing the darkness from behind them. The unmistakable sparkle and boom of a magic explosive filled the air. The salamanders must have launched them in a last-ditch effort, but their aim was off. Leafa and her friends slowed down, planning to let the bombs hit the ground, and then make a run for it. The lights plummeted to the earth about 30 feet ahead. Leafa raised her right arm to shield her face, preparing for the blast. But what happened next caught her completely off guard. A loud rumble shook the air, and a massive rock wall burst out of the bridge ahead, blocking their way. The girl's face twisted in anger, and she let out a frustrated curse. Oh no, she muttered. Kirito's eyes went wide with surprise, but he didn't hesitate. He quickly pulled out his sword and held it high as he charged towards the rock wall.
Hey Kirito, she yelled,
trying to warn him that it was a bad idea, but he wasn't listening. Kirito smashed into the wall with all his strength, but it didn't even leave a mark. He bounced back and landed on his butt. The wall was a big brown rock face that looked totally unharmed. A girl with wings skidded to a stop next to him, her wings spread wide. It's pointless, she said, looking at Kirito with a serious expression. Kirito glared up at her, clearly frustrated. You could have told me that sooner, he said, still catching his breath. The girl shrugged. Not with how fast you ran ahead, she replied. We've got a problem. This barrier is powered by earth magic, which means physical attacks won't touch it. We can try using lots of attack spells to break it down, but that's gonna take time. And we don't have time, someone said, turning around to face the bridge. That's when they saw them, a group of warriors in shiny blood-red armor stepping onto the bridge. One person had an idea. What if they just flew around the barrier instead? Want to jump into the water? Kirito asked, but she quickly said no. Like I just told you, there's a super powerful dragon living in this lake, she explained. If we go in without help from an undine, it's like asking to get hurt really badly. Kirito gripped his huge sword tightly again. I guess that means we have to fight then. Leafa nodded, biting her lip as if getting ready for a tough battle. This is our only choice, but it's not a great one. The salamander is using a super powerful earth magic spell, the kind that usually requires a really skilled magician. There must be a talented mage hiding among them. One good thing is that the bridge is really narrow, so we don't have to worry about the enemies surrounding us from all sides. Leafa and Kirito were in big trouble. They were outnumbered, with only 2 of them against 12 enemies. To make things worse, they were stuck in a dungeon where flying wasn't an option. Leafa's best skill was aerial combat, but it was useless here. Their only hope was that the enemy fighters wouldn't be too tough, but Leafa didn't think they could count on that. She pulled out her long katana and stood back to back with Kirito, ready to face whatever came next. Leafa's eyes locked onto the enemy force as they marched towards her. The sound of clanking metal filled the air. 3 huge salamanders led the group, their thick armor making them look almost invincible. They were even more protected than the ones she had seen before. Each salamander held a scary weapon in one hand, and a big metal shield in the other, looking super intimidating. Suddenly something clicked in Leafa's mind. In the virtual world of Alo, things felt super realistic. One thing that stood out was how players used their hands, just like in real life. It seemed weird that all 3 of them were left-handed, since that's not very common. But before she could say anything about it, Kirito jumped into the conversation. I know you're really good at fighting, he said, but I need to ask you something. Can you handle being our backup this time? The other player looked confused. What do you mean? Kirito explained. I want you to hang back and focus on keeping us healed, instead of fighting on the front lines. I get it, Leafa said, eyeing the double-edged sword in his hands. Using that thing in a tight space would be super tricky. He'd have to be careful not to hit her by mistake. Leafa wasn't exactly the healing type, but she trusted him, so she nodded and backed away until her back was almost touching the magic wall. No time for arguing. Kirito had to act fast. He crouched low and twisted his body, yanking the sword back as far as it would go. The 3 huge salamanders were closing in, their powerful bodies moving like a massive wave. Kirito's small frame was stretched to the limit, his muscles straining so hard that Leafa could almost hear them cracking under the pressure. She could see the energy building up inside him, like a big cloud of power waiting to burst out. The distance between Kirito and the enemy warriors vanished in an instant. See! Kirito yelled, stomping his left foot forward. At the same time, he swung his glowing blue sword in a wide flat arc at the 3 crimson fighters. The air seemed to tear apart as the sword sliced through it, making a loud screaming sound. The bridge shook beneath their feet from the force of Kirito's attack. Leafa watched in awe. This was the strongest blow she had ever seen Kirito unleash. She stared in shock, her eyes wide with surprise. But the 3 salamanders didn't attack. Instead, they huddled together, holding up their big shields to create a wall of protection. Then, Kirito's sword came crashing down on the shields. The impact was huge, making a super loud clang that made the air feel electric. The force of the hit sent ripples spreading out across the lake, like waves from a stone thrown into the water. The soldiers held their ground, barely budging against the attack. Leafa quickly checked on their health. Each warrior had lost over 10% of their HP. Just in time, healing spells came to the rescue. The sound of magic filled the air, and a light blue glow covered their bodies. Instantly, their health was back to full. Next, fiery orange balls shot up from behind the shield wall, soaring toward the cave ceiling, before diving down towards Kirito. A massive explosion rocked the lake, turning its surface a deep red. The tiny figure in black was engulfed by the blast. Kirito. Leafa screamed in horror. Kirito's health bar dropped drastically, falling all the way into the yellow zone. It was a miracle he didn't die right then and there in this game. Even small hits can be deadly. The girl had never seen such a precise and powerful magical attack. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she suddenly understood what their enemies were planning. They knew Kirito was super strong when it came to close combat, so they came up with a plan to counter that. Meanwhile, the three tough-looking players in front didn't make a move to attack. The guards stood firm, hiding behind their thick shields. No matter how hard Kirito swung his sword, he couldn't land a knockout blow because he couldn't get past their defenses. Behind the guards, 9 more players waited. Some of them were healers, busy patching up the guards' wounds. The others were casting spells, sending waves of fireballs crashing down on Kirito. This was the kind of team-up you'd expect to see when players were about to take down a super tough boss monster. But what was going on here? Why had so many players joined forces to go after Kirito and Leafa? Leafa didn't have time to think about it though. She was too busy getting ready to help her friends. She lined up a powerful healing spell just as Kirito emerged from the dying flames. As soon as he was clear, Leafa cast the best healing magic she knew to help him recover. Kirito's health started to come back, but he knew it wouldn't last long. He figured out the enemy's plan too, realizing that a long fight wouldn't work out in his favor. Kirito quickly turned to face the shield bearers, his sword ready. "Raha!" he shouted as his sleek black sword crashed into their shields, sending sparks flying everywhere. But the battle was already becoming a grim game of numbers. Every time Kirito swung his sword and landed a hit, the mages in the back would cast healing spells to fix the damage, making it seem like he wasn't getting anywhere. The other mages unleashed a barrage of long-range attack spells, sending flames pouring down on Kirito. Leafa hated battles like this. They were predictable, and didn't allow for any creative moves. It all came down to one thing. Would the mages run out of magic power, or would Kirito's health disappear first? The fight was stuck in a routine, with no room for surprises or clever tricks. The outcome was a no-brainer. Kirito was in big trouble again.
A barrage of fireballs came crashing down on him, surrounding him with a blast of orange light. The force was so strong that it lifted him off the ground and slammed him backward into the dirt. Luckily, the virtual world of Elo didn't make players feel real pain, but getting hit with explosive magic was still super uncomfortable.
A massive jolt slammed into Kirito's mind, making his skin feel like it was on fire. He lost his balance and stumbled. The weird thing was that these virtual knocks could affect his real body too. Sometimes he'd get pounding headaches and feel dizzy for hours after a tough battle. As he took another hit, Kirito let out a fierce cry, "Roach, Kastemba," but he refused to give up. Every time he got knocked down, he jumped back to his feet, ready to charge forward with his sword flashing in the light. Leafa was trying to help Kirito with her recovery spells, but she could feel his pain too. It was just a game after all. Anyone would quit when things seemed impossible. Losing was tough, but sometimes the numbers just didn't add up in your favor. So why was Kirito so determined? Leafa couldn't bear watching him struggle like this. She took a few steps closer and yelled, "Kirito, it's okay. We can fly back to Swilvan in just a few hours and start over. And we can always buy back the stuff we lost." "This is pointless." Kirito's voice was barely above a whisper, but his words were firm. He didn't even bother to turn around. His eyes fixed on something ahead. The fire surrounding them made his eyes look red and fierce. "No way," he said. "As long as I'm breathing, I won't let any of my teammates get hurt. That's one thing I just can't accept." His words left her speechless. When things seem hopeless, people react in different ways. When it happened, people reacted in all kinds of ways. Some tried to laugh it off, but it was a pretty awkward laugh. Others closed their eyes and got really tense. And then there were those who just kept on swinging, even when it was all over. But no matter how they reacted, something cool happened. Everyone started to get used to dying in the game. It's just something that happens when you play a virtual reality game like this one. Each player had to find their own way to deal with it and move on. The game didn't feel like a game anymore. But then Leafa saw something in Kirito's eyes that she had never seen before. The fierce light that shone brightly. His eyes were filled with a strong desire to beat the impossible odds against them, and find a way to survive. For a moment she even forgot they were inside a virtual world. Kirito let out a loud battle cry, "Resolve." The sound was so powerful that it made the air vibrate. As soon as the enemy stopped firing, he made a wild dash at the wall of shields. He switched his sword to his right hand, and used his left to try and grab the edge of a shield. With a fierce tug, he tried to pull it away from the others. This surprise move caught everyone off guard, and the line of shields started to break apart. He shoved his sword into a tiny hole in their defense. Leafa's eyes went wide. She'd been playing this game since the beginning, and had never seen anything like it. The guy had busted through their shield wall at super close range, and he didn't even use any magic. It was a weird move too. He hadn't made a real attack, so it wouldn't do much damage. Leafa did something that seemed crazy, and people behind the wall started yelling. "What is he thinking?" Someone shouted. Just then, a soft voice whispered in Leafa's ear. "Now's our only chance." She turned to see Yue sitting on her shoulder. "Chance?" Leafa asked. Yue explained. "The only thing we don't know for sure is what the enemy is thinking. Use all your remaining power to defend yourself against the next attack, no matter what it takes." Leafa started to protest, but her words trailed off. It felt like trying to hold back a huge wave, with just a tiny splash of water. Yui, a simple AI, locked eyes with her, showing the same determination she had just seen in Kirito. Leafa nodded like she got it, and then threw her arms up in the air. The enemy mages were already getting ready to cast their next fireball spell, but this time they seemed to be taking a little longer than usual. It was as if they were trying to time their attack just right. She blurted out magic words as fast as she could. One little mistake and the whole spell would fall apart, but she had no other choice. Her lips and tongue moved super quickly. She managed to finish her spell just a tiny bit faster. Suddenly, a swarm of tiny butterflies shot out of her hands and surrounded Kirito's body. Then in an instant, the enemy's spell exploded into action. Another wave of fireballs came crashing down, screaming through the air like a bombing raid. Kirito was getting hit with bursts of flames as he clung to the wall of shields for protection. Prigin. Leafa covered her face from the blast and gritted her teeth. Every time Kirito's magic shield blocked an exploding fireball, she felt her energy draining away. She could see her MP bar shrinking chunk by chunk. Drinking a special potion might help, but it wouldn't work fast enough to save them now. Yu suddenly let out a loud shout. "Now, Papa!" Leafa's eyes snapped forward. Through the red flames, she saw Kirito stand up straight, his sword ready to go. She heard bits of magic spells being chanted, and tried to remember what they meant. Wait a minute. Wasn't that illusion magic? Leafa held her breath for a second, then gritted her teeth. Kirito was using a spell that made a player look like a monster, but it wasn't very helpful in battles. The spell chose a random monster, based on how strong the person casting it was. Usually though, it turned the player into a weak and pretty boring creature. The problem was, even though the player looked different, their stats stayed the same, so there wasn't much to be scared of. Leafa's magic energy, called mana, had dropped really low. It was now less than 10%. She had done what you suggested. But things didn't go as planned. The dice hadn't rolled in her favor. But she knew it wasn't the dice's fault. In a game that relied on skill, knowing what you're doing was key. Kirito was still pretty new to all this, having only started a few days ago. It wouldn't be fair to expect him to know every single spell, and how to use it. She gathered her last bit of energy, and put it into her hand. The enemy's last fireballs were about to hit at the exact same moment. Her shield would disappear. Then an even bigger explosion of flames erupted, and slowly started to fade away.
She wondered.
As the fire died down, a dark figure began to take shape. It was like a black shadow coming to life from the wall of flames. For a split second she thought her eyes were tricking her into seeing things that weren't really there. This thing was way too big to be real. It was at least twice as tall as the huge salamanders that already looked like giants. As Leafa took a closer look, she saw it was a giant with its back hunched over. "Is that you, Kirito?" she whispered. It had to be him. There was no other explanation. This must be what Kirito looked like after using his illusion spell. But the size was crazy. Leafa stood frozen in shock as the dark figure slowly lifted its head. This creature was no giant, but it was still super intimidating. Its head was shaped like a goat's, with two long curved horns sticking out of the back, and they looked seriously mean. The eyes glowed bright red, like embers from a fire, and flames danced between its sharp fangs. The top part of its body was as black as coal, with muscles bulging out all over. Its arms were ridiculously long and muscular, hanging down so low that its fists almost touched the ground. A long skinny tail shot out from its waist, looking super creepy. This thing was seriously scary. It looked like something from a nightmare. The salamanders were totally frozen in place, like they'd lost all control. The dark creature slowly lifted its head towards the ceiling, and let out an ear-piercing roar. Grossa! This time the ground really did start shaking beneath their feet. The salamanders felt a deep primal fear rising up inside them. One of them in the front line took a few steps back, screaming at the top of its lungs, "Beea!" The monster moved super fast, its speed sending chills down your spine. One of its clawed hands shot into the gap between the shields and poked the heavily armed warrior with one finger. In a flash the salamander vanished, leaving behind only a red end flame. What? The other two salamanders in the front let out identical cries of shock and alarm as they watched their friend get taken down in just one hit. The fighters dropped their shields and grabbed their weapons with their left hands, slowly backing away. Suddenly, an angry yell burst out from the magic users at the back of the group. It was probably their leader who shouted, "Don't break ranks, you idiots! He might look scary and have long arms, but he can't hurt us if we stick together." But the warriors didn't listen to him. The black demon let out a deafening roar and attacked. It chomped down on the man on the right with its huge jaws, and grabbed the ones on the left with its sharp claws. Then it slammed them to the ground with incredible force. Two loud crunching sounds marked the end of their fight. Small red flames shot out of their bodies, like blood pouring out. In a flash less than 10 seconds, all three warriors at the front were gone. The leader of the group took a deep breath and started giving new orders. The mages began casting their spells again, but they were very different from the strong fighters who had been defending earlier. These mages didn't wear any armor, just red gloves to protect their hands. They were also very scared. A big black demon was standing in front of them, breathing out angry hisses that sounded really mean. The demon's presence was making the mages even more terrified than their spells could make it. The sorcerers were trying to cast a spell, but it was taking them way too long. Before they could finish, the demon swung its arm in a vicious swipe. The two sorcerers in front didn't stand a chance. They were tossed through the air like rag dolls. As they flew, their bodies burst into flames, turning into red fire before hitting the ground. The air was filled with terrified screams and the sound of shattering glass. The giant arm swung forward, sending two more salamanders flying. The leader, easy to spot with his fancy magic gear, was now in trouble. He had been safe in the middle of the group, but now he was all alone, and freaking out. His skinny face was frozen in a panicked scream. He tried to cast a spell, but it backfired, and the glow between his hands turned into a cloud of dark smoke. Kurito's demon took a thunderous step forward, and let out another ear-shaking roar. The salamander leader let out a tiny gasp and waved his hands in the air, looking totally helpless. "Our retreat, retreat," he tried to say, but he didn't get to finish. The demon crouched down for a second, then sprang into action. It jumped right into the middle of the huddled mages, making the bridge shake like crazy when it landed. What happened next was a total disaster. It wasn't even a real fight. Every time the demon swiped its claws, a huge blast of flame shot out, causing massive destruction.